I'd like to welcome Ian Urbina and also Tim Isgett into conversation. Ian, we'll get to him in just a second, and I think he has, quite the walk-on reel there, so we don't need a big introduction. But Tim is a fellow board member of mine for Media Impact Funders, and his day job is he's the managing director of Humana United, and he has contributed to funding part of Ian's Outlaw Ocean work. Ian is an investigative reporter, a National Geographic explorer, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the project and what's next. And Ian, I really want to hear how you would weave together some of the conversations we've just been observing into your reporting. But first, I'll start with the big why. Why the ocean? Why focus there?
I think a couple reasons. One, I was on staff at the New York Times for 18 years, 17 years, and as a journalist up until a year ago. And as a journalist, I think you're always, especially as an investigative journalist, you're always looking for, virgin snow, topically, and you're looking for stories that offer the potential to say new things or package old things in new ways. And the 2/3 of the planet that's water, kind of emerged as this ripe frontier for storytelling. And then, before becoming a journalist, I was an anthropologist, and I think that is relevant here just because in some ways the attraction to the ocean was as much about the interest in the diaspora tribe of people, the 56 million people that work out there from whom we rarely hear much, and yet they're essential to our economy, to our existence. So anthropologically, I was especially drawn to the space because it offered the chance to talk about and otherwise largely invisible people, and also to sort of explore stories at the intersection of human rights, labor, and environment. So for all those reasons, it just was a gift that kept on giving journalistically.
Yeah, and you did most of this reporting while on staff at the Times, correct?
We're going on year 7 now, and the first 2 years was a series that ran in the paper, and then I took 2 years off, much thanks to Humana United and other funders, to produce the book. And then now we're a year on top of that, post the book. So it's an even portion times non-times.
But did you think originally, was this always a book in your head? Was it a series of articles for the Times? Was it going to be your life's work? I want to know, how you started thinking about it and where you are in thinking about it now. And then I'm going to turn to Tim.
Yeah. So when I was working on my dissertation, I ran away from it and took a year off and worked on a ship. And that was my first introduction to the space. And then ultimately, when I got hired by the Times, I harbored this ambition to get the Gray Lady to pay to send me to sea so I could land that story that I never got to really tackle anthropologically. And then when I finally found an editor who was willing to take the leap with me, her name is Rebecca Corbett, I had kind of 3 ambitions in the body of it. One was methodological in the sense that I wanted to do long form narrative, explanatory, sort of polished, investigative storytelling, but I also wanted to try to do it differently in the sense that I really wanted to get out into the space and tell these stories with eyeball, kind of firsthand, 5 senses type writing. And not attempt to do these things remotely, call them in onshore, interviewing deckhands and the like when they returned. And then the other sort of big ambitions were topical. I wanted to reimagine the space. I mean, the space, that 2/3 of the planet that's water, had long been sort of thought of in literature and journalism as this kind of almost a watery desert that you fly over. Most of us landlubbers fly over, and no one's out there, and there's marine life, but it's just Maersk container ships and that's about it, some fishing vessels. And I wanted to blow that definition up and show to folks that this is actually a vibrant, well-populated bustling frontier, and largely ungoverned, ungovernable, maybe even, but generally extra legal space. And there was a vast diversity, and that was the other goal topically of things happening out there, sort of expand the taxonomy of understanding of the species of activity and players that are out there, not just BP spill or Somali piracy, but also sea slavery and, arms trafficking and murder of stowaways and, illegal dumping and, a range of illegal whaling and all sorts of other things happening out there that are riveting. So those were some of the ambitions.
Yeah. And Tim, I'm wondering as a funder and all the need in the world, why Ian? Why this project? What attracted Humana United and you to it?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Caitlin. And I want to also just thank Michael and Vic, Ian and Pete for sharing their work with us today. I'm with Humanity United. We're a human rights focused foundation. And I would just also, it's great to be part of the program, particularly this program on climate justice, because as we know, so much social human degradation and exploitation in the world is intimately intertwined with climate, environmental degradation, exploitation, climate justice. So thank you for having me. Part of our theory of change as an organization is that we believe that you have to be aware and you have to understand human rights issues. It's sort of the first step to addressing them. So we've spent a lot of time over the last decade supporting media around these issues, specifically journalists and media outlets who are interested in shining a light on the systems that contribute to the abuses of human rights and dignity in the world. And thanks to both Michael and Vic for talking about the systems earlier. We've also worked over the last decade on the really specific issue of forced labor on Thai fishing vessels. And I think it was about 6 years ago, maybe Ian contacted us, knowing that we were working on this. He started talking about his series for the New York Times. And he also let us know that he was interested in writing a book, and just appreciating Ian's dedication to the sort of issues of lawlessness and inhumanity at sea. In addition to his capacity as a storyteller, clearly, we provided him a sort of modest grant for the development of his book. I think what we didn't appreciate at the time, or maybe perhaps couldn't have predicted, is that Ian's work would continue in the way that it has. And I think he's going to talk about that in a little bit. And I would just make this note as a funder too. I think we often make investments to have impact. And Ian is such a terrific example of sort of unanticipated impact and reach. We funded a book, and it's become so much more than that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Ian, so what is the more than that? We'll stop being coy here. Tell us what you're up to now.
Well, I mean, at its root, the more than that is built on a foundation that is the same that it was at the beginning, and it must stay true to that foundation. And what I'm referring to is, I left the Times, became a contract writer so that I could publish in the magazine, but created a nonprofit called the Outlaw Ocean Project, with at its root the foundational ambition of producing 4, 5, 6 major high gloss, kind of tier 1 level investigative narrative stories, and that have the same methodological ambitions that I cited originally. Get out into space and talk about the range of concerns that all add up to a general lack of governance at sea, be they labor, be they human rights, be they environmental concerns, and give life to the 56 million people out there who are doing this work. But it starts with storytelling, and really told in this rigorous, polished way. And then the other ambition that I carried with me into this new endeavor was to try to innovate in the methods of distribution. So one of the frustrations I had, I only ever worked for the New York Times and have nothing but wonderful things to say about it as a journalistic institution. I think it's one of the best around. But the Gray Lady is a slow-moving sort of entity. And when it comes to innovation and distribution, how you ensure that the investment in a story gets seen, and also even innovation in translating that story into other mediums, other products. That was one place where I was frustrated creatively. And I wanted, in this new chapter of my professional career, to really lean into the attempt to innovate in distribution. Because I thought, if you're going to drop $500,000 on a series over the course of 24 months, you probably should think about not just running single 4,000, 5,000 word stories, but think about a whole slate of other things that you'll do from the same core material. So in my case, the innovation and distribution sort of front of what I have been doing has lots of aspirations and different chapters, but the first chapter of it was taking the reporting and teaming up with musicians around the world, be they classical, ambient, electronic, a diversity of different musicians in different genres, and attempting to recruit them to engage with the stories in two different ways. One was, I think of as a top-down way, which was this classical soloist pianist would read the book and feel an emotional connection to specific material within it, up to them what, and then write music that attempts to, in that different language, tell these stories, their language of music. That's the top-down sort of emotional relationship, interpretive relationship. The bottom-up relationship is, it took the 5 years of reporting and stripped from it rich sound. And the sound is either ambient or prose. So the sound is either, there are two different archives of field recordings. The ambient is textured sounds like machine gun fire in Somalia or chanting Cambodian deckhands on the South China Sea. That's ambient textured sound. And then the other is the prose archive, which is Secretary of State John Kerry at the UN talking about the reporting, or interviews I've done, or other people talking about characters, interviews even with individuals in the reporting. Take this collection of sounds, and the bottom-up relationship with the musician is put that ingredient bucket, if you will, at their disposal and ask them if creatively they feel motivated to use those sounds in the music. Ultimately, what they produce is this 5-track EP. We put out an album. We put the music out and publish it in a standard way that you might digitally, not CDs, but Spotify, Pandora, Sirius Radio, etc., YouTube Music. And the play here journalistically is, number one, there are almost 4 experiments going on at the same time. One is the creative experiment. It's this experiment in translation, in moving from words to music. The second is a sort of experiment in distribution, in the sense that if my 16-year-old son doesn't read the New York Times or New Yorker, and when I publish there, how do I get stuff in front of him, into his head? And same thing with readers in Australia that might not see stuff that I'm writing for these US-focused venues. So the thought there was, from a distribution play, why don't we go to where they are, and where a lot of people are consuming a lot of information are on alternate platforms like YouTube and Spotify. And so the distribution play was bringing our content over, pairing it with the music, making a music video that talks about the footage, having interesting back-end explanations as to what this music is about, as an alternate way to get at people in a different way and at different people. And then the other 2 experiments are, the notion of social change and driving social change through journalism. I'm a journalist, not an advocate, but I do have an agenda. I want people to, through my storytelling and explanation, understand this realm better, and then have an informed way of making decisions about how to fix things. And I think the social change experiment here is using these alternate platforms and the translated versions to roll out the reporting in a longer runway, and have more people, but over a longer period of time, consuming the stuff. And then the last experiment, then I'll shut up, is there's an experiment in funding. Everyone knows, especially in this room, like, that journalism is struggling in terms of financial models, and relying on the generosity of Tim and Nat Geo and Humanity United is amazing, but not a sustainable from a journalistic point of view plan. And so I'm trying to figure out alternate ways to monetize the journalism and the reporting. You know, if I'm paid $8,000 by a magazine to produce a story that costs $85,000, I got to figure out some way to close that gap. And the music model has a streaming revenue source. It's pennies, but it adds up when you do it at scale, that funds all the money we make goes directly back into the nonprofit, which funds new stories. And so that's the other experiment here. And then just to sense, initially I had planned on doing this with 4 artists. Right as of last week, we had 415 artists from 90 countries, each artist producing a 5-track album that will be producing 50 albums every 2 months, releasing them for the next 20 months. So it has grown to this massive thing. And what's really exciting about that is the collective listenership and even eyeballs on Spotify and these other platforms between all those artists is 80 million. And that's more than eyeballs at the New York Times in a year. So there is really something really exciting about all the experiments that I think may actually work.
I think the scale is hard to comprehend, right? Thank you, Ian, so much for sharing your project and where it's going. And I see that Roshni has already put the link to the Outlaw Ocean music project in the chat. So everyone make sure to check it out on Spotify. And also, if you haven't read the book, do. It's captivating. It's amazing.
If they want to reflect on solastalgia and from their lens, if they're experiencing, if it resonates with you, and if there are other ways of applying that concept?
I'll throw in one point. I wish I knew that term when I was writing the book, because I struggled to capture this thing I noticed among especially long haul fishermen, but seafarers who spend real amounts of time away from home, that they seem caught between two places. And on the one hand, they seem very much at home at sea, as much as they might suffer abuses of various sorts. And then, but they long for their family and landed life. But then when they get back to land, they feel almost in a PTSD sort of way, ill-equipped to readjust to that realm and the amount of stimulation and the pace of it all and all these things, or ex-offenders, seeking to readjust to life on the outside. I mean, you can look at a lot of different communities and use that term to better capture potentially what emotionally and psychologically that they might be going through. So it's a really beautiful thing you've created there.
I'm curious about what is storytelling for racial and environmental justice kind of impact in organizing like in a virtual world?
Yeah, I mean, so that methodological point of ensuring that you get out there becomes a bit of a problem when you can't get on a plane or a boat. On the other hand, and furthermore, if this diaspora tribe, 56 million people, are of interest largely because they're transient and unusually invisible, many of them migrant, many of them undocumented, and then geographically separated from, anyone that would maybe protect them or check up on them. So if this population was already invisible and inaccessible, COVID has made it 10 times worse. A lot of them are stranded. Commerce has slowed down. So there are boats, hundreds upon hundreds of boats that we're hearing about daily, where you've got seafarers stuck and they have no idea how they're going to get on land anywhere. And so the problem has become very acute from a storytelling point of view and the challenges of telling it. On the other hand, on the distribution side, for us at the Outlaw Ocean Project, it's been a boon, frankly, because a lot of musicians are stuck and their events are canceled and they too can't travel and they can't tour. And so they've been very eager to jump on board the project. And so we've been really doing a lot of really great stuff on the distribution front, but on the journalism front, it's been tough.
And Pete? Ian, did you want to offer any observation on that last point?
No, I mean, I think all three, Pete, Mike, and Vic, really touched on systemic change through journalism. I think in my own work, what Michael was saying, I think hit a note with me in that pausing, you're writing a 5,000 word piece for the New Yorker, and before you file it to your editor, you stop and think, have I done right by the people I disagree with in this piece? And often that demographic in your own story won't engage with you. They won't answer your calls. And so you actually have to channel their perspective without them sometimes. And that sense of duty is one of the methodological things that I think us in journalism have to not forget about, because that runs us into the very problem that Michael was identifying. In each individual product that we put out, does some work towards explaining perspectives, be they marginalized communities or non-marginalized communities, but really trying to, from an explanatory perspective, understanding things, even for those that won't engage with you. So that's just one thing that I think is a change factor in how you do long form narrative journalism. So that I'll just stop there with that.